All right. So, as usual, when talking to me, I like history. I like context. So, in evaluating the Arctic as a geopolitical chess piece and grand strategy, last week we talked about this map. I'd like to start with this map. This is something you guys remember. It's William Gilpin's economic, just, and correct map of the world. For those who haven't seen last week's episode, go watch it. For those who have seen it, you know that this was an 1890 map, which was part of a book called The Cosmopolitan Railway, where William Gilpin, Lincoln's former bodyguard, the first governor of the territory of Colorado, and leading hero who's been scrubbed out of history, leading hero who largely won the Civil War by keeping the Western Front from opening up to the South. He basically used Lincoln's greenbacks to create self-generated credit through the Colorado Treasury that he used to fund and pay for his military and militias that otherwise there was no means financially to pay for them in 1862. And it was through that technique that he was able to grow a serious militia that was able to intervene upon the opening up of a Western Front, which it's questionable whether Lincoln, even with the help of the Russians, who largely turned the tide of the Civil War in 1863, when they came in with the Russian naval fleets to the Atlantic and the Pacific, even without that assistance, it's questionable whether Lincoln would have been able to stop a three-fronted war, because he already had to deal with the terrorist operations coming down from British Canada. That was something that was underway the whole time. The British were happy to let the Confederacy use Montreal, Toronto as secret Confederacy headquarters, where, again, terrorist operations were run. Wilkes Booth was later deployed from Montreal to kill Lincoln. He had to deal with, obviously, the South. But if he had a Western Front, not sure that would have worked out. So Gilpin was known as the prophet of manifest destiny. He represented not the imperial Andrew Jackson manifest destiny that ran the Trail of Tears and is largely why people hate the word manifest destiny rubs people very badly, and for good reason, for what a lot of the misuse of it has justified throughout the years, including the wars of Mexico, imperial wars in the Philippines, and more. So there's a positive manifest destiny too that people forget about, and this is what Gilpin represented. So he was one of the leading founding fathers of the Transcontinental Railway, which he was one of the first voices to start organizing for this in the 1840s, more than 20 years before it began. His idea, as well as the people working with him, was always to create a rail line that would open up the Pacific and ultimately lead to a communion of Asia and the United States as the oldest and newest civilizations. It was very progressive. It was really quite something. And when it finally was built, the Transcontinental, in 1869, it was finished. The idea was to extend this through the Bering Strait, and that's what Gilpin devoted the last 35 years of his life to advancing. He says also in his writings that Lincoln supported this connection through British Canada, through British Columbia, which was going to become annexed to the United States after the Civil War, had not certain people been taken out, including the governor of British Columbia, Frederick Seymour, who was probably assassinated, who was a friend of the Republican cause, and it was going to go through Alaska, through the Bering Strait. It's a 100-kilometer gap, and into Eurasia. And in Gilpin's works, he very clearly talks about the need to finance this through a new system of international banks run by sovereign nation states to develop full-spectrum economies. He cites Alexander Hamilton. He cites Henry Clay as the role models of how this funding could work to destroy the British Empire and the unipolar system of the British Empire, which controlled only the world through choke points on seas, much like it works today. So, just to put some faces on some of these figures, we have Ulysses S. Grant, Charles Sumner, William Seward, and then on the right there is Gilpin, close-up of the Transcontinental Railway. It was always meant to have a northern line and to go up through, like I said, Alaska, through the West Coast. These are some of the American system Lincoln followers in Russia who applied this method to build the Trans-Siberian Railway. What we have there is Tsar Alexander II, the Great Liberator, who was known for freeing the serfs a year before Lincoln declared the Emancipation Proclamation. We have Count Sergeyevita, the transport minister and later prime minister of Russia. On the upper left, we have Dmitry Mendeleev, the famous chemist, who is actually the head of the protective tariff policy for Russia. He came to the United States and studied how America used the protective tariff against British free trade and brought that back. And there's some of his speeches, which are still available online, where he's destroying British free trade. And this guy's known as the discoverer of the periodic table of chemistry. But it's amazing to look at this other aspect of him as a patriot and a follower of the American system. So we have a lot. These are just a few. There's many more figures who used Baldwin locomotives from Philadelphia that were used to build the rail cars, the tracks that was American made with American help. And the idea was to always connect this through the Bering Strait. Count Sergeyevich speaks about this. There were similar allies in China later on around Sun Yat-sen, who had applied the same policy for the international development of China around Germany with Otto von Bismarck, which we talked about last week, who was going to also extend this into the Zollverein and the German rail system that was going to connect to the Ottoman Empire that wanted to modernize at this point. It didn't have to be destroyed, but that required a different timeline of history to unfold. So we know that a bunch of wars, a bunch of assassinations, literally like 18 assassinations of leading figures got in the way of this throughout the late 19th century into the 20th century. A color revolution run by, Warburg, J.P. Morgan connected bankers and Rothschild bankers who funded a Bolshevik revolution also got in the way, where Tsar Nicholas II, who was, again, an advocate of the Bering Strait rail tunnel, he even commissioned a team of American engineers in 1906 to do feasibility studies on the Bering Strait. That was Tsar Nicholas II. He had some psychological problems and some anti-Semitic problems that caused him to make some missteps. That was later on an unfortunate tragedy. But when the when the Tsarist system was overthrown through this color revolution, this was destroyed. The two world wars didn't help at all. And it took another 4 decades until Henry Wallace came in. And Wallace, I'm setting the stage. I'm going to get into some meaty stuff soon, but for the time being, Wallace brought this back. So Wallace had a good relationship with Foreign Minister Molotov. Wallace was Franklin Roosevelt's vice president.
Yep.
And Wallace
32nd degree Mason, if I'm not mistaken.
32nd degree. Well, that's, what, he definitely was a Mason. He was an admirer of theosophy. So he had a bit of a mystic bent. But he was also a multi-generational farmer, an agricultural engineer, and he really did love human beings. Yeah, he really, you read his writings, you look at everything he did consistently throughout his life, he devoted himself to humanity. So it's not so clear cut to accuse someone as being guilty by association.
He's not a luminist, crazy psychopath. He's just, I get it. Theosophy, philosophy, I got it.
Yeah, like it's difficult to condemn everybody for being, guilty by association. He's a good example of it. I had to go through that too. George Washington, Marquis Lafayette, like Mozart. They're all Masons as well. Does that mean everybody who's connected to Masonry is evil, or is there some nuance that I might be missing? And sure enough, there is nuance because there has been a battle in
nuance.
Yeah, and there's a battle within Masonry as well between, or I think less so today than it was back then. There was still some humanist resistance within that utilized and operated through some Masonic lodges back then. I think largely most of that humanist resistance has been mostly squashed as far as I could see in the past 80 years. But anyway, that's another show to explore that idea. But he did write in 1944 of his meetings with Molotov, with Stalin, and with FDR, and the vision for a U.S.-Russia China alliance to be the bedrock for the new system that was going to come online, which internationalized Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, the same way that Gilpin was trying to work to internationalize Lincoln's program as well. So this quote that I took from an essay he published in Survey Geographic magazine, he described this meeting saying, of nations, and I'm sorry, part of my thing is cut off here, of all nations, Russia has the most powerful combination of a rapidly increasing population, great natural resources, and immediate expansion in technological skills. Siberia and China will furnish the greatest frontier of tomorrow. When Molotov, Russia's foreign minister, was in Washington in the spring of 1942, I spoke to him about the combined highway and airway, which I hope someday will link Chicago and Moscow via Canada, Alaska, and Siberia. Molotov, after observing that no one nation could do this job by itself, said that he and I would live to see the day of its accomplishment. It would mean much to the peace of the future if there could be some tangible link of this sort between the pioneer spirit of our own West and the frontier spirit of the Russian East. That there's so many things that he said and wrote about, and other people like Harry Dexter White also with FDR had envisioned for an anti-imperial, multipolar, win-win post-war order. But we know that the Rhodes Scholars and other British operatives got their way instead. Roosevelt died early, probably by poisoning. We can't know because there was never an autopsy. And all of his allies, like Wallace, were labeled commie red spies. Their careers were destroyed, and the Cold War was created when Truman and Churchill declared
Truman was so off base in his view of Russia and what Russia was doing in World War II. It was incredible to read Truman's writing. He basically, what Truman and the guy who I pin as the number one problem for Exceptional Stand, the origin, the myth of Exceptional Stand started, George Patton. And Truman's writing and Patton's writing, they mirror each other. Patton was an idiot.
Yeah,
he was a bloody idiot of the grandest scale. Of all the great generals mentioned, when you read the works of Europeans, Russians, and anybody else that was alive during that time, the name Patton wasn't even mentioned. You hear of Hodges, Bradley, Montgomery. You hear of de Gaulle. You hear of everybody except Patton. You hear of Zhukov. You hear of Manstein. You hear of Rommel. You hear of Guderian.
Yeah.
And they took this guy who was a literal nut job, who was so stupid, in fact, that he would have visions of reincarnation, stating himself to be the Marshal of Napoleon. And we know how that worked out with Napoleon, didn't we, Matt?
Yeah, I mean,
the Marshal of Napoleon against Russia. It's crazy.
He served some useful roles at killing Nazis at different times in World War II. But yeah, this guy was actually on record saying we should use the atomic bomb against the Soviets before the Cold War, when the Soviets were still our friends.
And not only that, Matt, he was a nut job in the sense that he went to Eisenhower and he went to Omar Bradley and said, "You give me a week and I'll give you Moscow." At the time, he had an army of the Third Army, which really fought nobody.
Yeah.
He had an army of 60,000 people, of 60,000 guys who fought no one, right? Yeah. Versus a battle-hardened military from Russia that numbered 6.1 million, that just faced off the most battle-hardened, German high-level SS regiments like you would not believe, the most toughest panzer divisions, and grinded them out. And this moron wants to take 61,000 troops who have no experience, this blowhard who walks around with pistols and deactivated grenades, and he wants to go do that. I mean, and it's his mythos that Hollywood took and created the whole Exceptional Stand.
Yeah.
It's him. Yeah. It's him, Matt.
I hear you, man. Right, I feel your pain. I feel your anger, man. No, it's good. It's righteous anger. Okay, so here, let me just now skip into the current thrust of the story. So this sort of sets the stage of the two potentials for this multipolar alliance with the expression of the true USA, the true idea of an anti-imperial manifest destiny. And what was happening when the Cold War was launched and all of a sudden our allies became our friends and our friends became our enemies. Our enemies became our allies and our allies became our enemies after World War II. You had the takeover of British intelligence that took over much of the U.S. foreign policy, much of academia, the media. The CIA was created in 1947. Mossad was created as well around that same time. But you had a whole new deep state infrastructure that was built up as part of the recapturing of the world by the British that never forgave the United States for what it did in 1776 or again in 1865 by staying whole. So not all of this this momentum for progress, though, of that was fought for by Wallace and by FDR and by others, not all of it could be crushed. There was still Arctic development. There was still this pro-industrial, build big project orientation that wasn't easily decapitated, although the British wanted to. So in the case of the North, of here in Canada where I live, as well as in Alaska, there was an incredible increase of standards of living of the native populations, especially the Inuits. They were developing skill sets, trade experiences. The Inuits were they were starting to work on construction projects. They were becoming engineers. So the population was increasing in quantity and in quality, and this had to stop. This had to be destroyed because the Arctic, to the degree that infrastructure was brought up there, the British Empire always knew that it was going to potentially rekindle the sense of common self-interest on the mutual Arctic territories that Molotov and Wallace were discussing. How did they block this? And this is where it gets really racist and ugly, and it still is shaping much of Canadian policy today for its native population. And this also is why people have to keep this in mind when they think of the absolute hypocrisy of Justin Trudeau and the Canadian government calling China a genocide country against its native minorities. So what we did is what's called, from 1953 to 58, the Northern Reallocation Project. It was a Privy Council run operation overseen by the RCMP that basically said it basically told these different natives that were living in a civilization in the South that had already integrated for a generation or more into society. It told them, no, this is not your natural state. You're out of your natural ecosystem. And what they did is they said, okay, we're going to give you financial incentives and we'll make it really easy. We're going to make a great life for you if you get on these boats, and we're going to put you in these various reserves that we're going to create throughout the Arctic, all the way up into northern Nunavut. Well, today it's called Nunavut. It wasn't called that then. All the way into the deep Arctic. And then you'll be in your natural ecosystems. And they did this to hundreds of natives and their families. Here's a couple. A couple of pictures. The one on the bottom is a young boy who later on was part of a class action lawsuit against the Canadian government, Larry Odlaluk, with his mom and dad at their new home in Nunavut. And it says here, the forced relocation was very difficult for his family. His mother was constantly crying, he says, and his father died 10 months after moving. Above, that's another family that was put in another colony in Grease Ford. I forgot their names, but as you could see, these are people who they're wearing, they're wearing Western clothing. They're not your typical, pure noble savage, the way some of these British anthropologists try to portray the natives. But they were put on a boat. They were moved up there, and they were just dropped off and left to literally to die. And when a Royal Commission report was put together, there was a 2-year Royal Commission to study the effects of what this policy did. Again, this is a 5-year policy, but it continued in a different way afterwards. They interviewed a lot of people, and one of the people they interviewed was a RCMP officer who was on duty at the time overseeing these tribes. And he says, this is a quote, he didn't understand why the Inuit were not given quarters at the base to live in, and why the ample food which was available at the base was not made available to them. The report continued. The servicemen were told that the Inuit were there to rehabilitate themselves. That means, heal themselves from the contamination of civilization and technology, to learn how to survive on their own and go back to their old way of living. The project was to see if they could survive in that high Arctic environment where Inuit had lived in earlier times. Temperatures of negative 55 degrees Celsius were common in the winter. And then during the actual trial a few years earlier by it's a class actions lawsuit, there's a quote from the testimonials. The lawyer of the representing the family said, there is overwhelming evidence to suggest that the central, if not the sole reasons for the relocation of the Inuit to the high Arctic was the desire by Canada to assert its sovereignty over Arctic islands and surrounding areas. Human flagpoles. That's what this was. It was human flagpoles. And basically there was no development. So it was very difficult for Canada or for the British to say to Russia or any other country sharing Arctic territory that, no, this land belongs to Ottawa. Well, how do you justify that? There's nobody living there. You have no intention to develop anything. How do you back that up? So they said, well, look, we have these people, these Canadians that are now located there, so it's ours. That was really all it was. So it was called the Human Flagpole policy, and it was racist as hell. People did starve and die and commit suicide. And this policy of telling natives that your culture is antithetical to Western colonial pro-technology culture that uses rationality. Yours is an irrational, spiritual, back to nature culture that is fundamentally incompatible. And that is the garbage that is cooked up and still taught to generations of people across the United States, across Canada, and even to the natives themselves, despite the fact that the natives living today in these territories generally don't even believe it anymore. And we're going to get back to that. I've got a lot of quotes. Now, this was stopped, and this is an interesting side lesson I wanted to just convey, because the closest guy, I mean, you know, the U.S. had their 9/11. They had a deep state coup against a president that was 4 years long against Donald Trump in recent times. Canada, I think the closest analog that we have to a Donald Trump personality type was John Diefenbaker. And there's a reason for that. I think a few words have to be said about him because he's so misunderstood by Canadians. Most Americans don't even know who he is. But what he tried to do, and what he largely even did do, is gives us a lot of keys into understanding how to problem solve and think through the current problem today, despite the fact that he was stupid on many other levels that led to his downfall and the failure of a lot of the great things he wanted to do. So I got 3 quotes from Diefenbaker that I'm going to read. That's a picture. That's 2 pictures of the guy. When he came into power in 1958, he shut down this racist policy. He stopped the Northern Relocation Project, and he basically he extended the Bill of Rights to natives across Canada. That's Métis, Indigenous, and Inuit. They represent today almost 1 million of the population. No, more than that. Anyway, he extended the Bill of Rights. He gave them the right to vote for the first time. There are a lot of other projects. And for the Arctic, what he basically said is, rather than just have human flagpoles, let's actually develop the technology of the Arctic and create new science cities. He spent $78 million on a study that was going to define what's called the Northern Frontier. What we have there is a Canadian government-funded diagram produced in 1958 of the domed nuclear city of Frobisher Bay, which would today be located in the territory of Nunavut. It was a city that was meant to house 5,000 people with their families. It was not one of these like resource extraction towns that just exist until the mines are tapped. It was not that. It had advanced scientific research. Like I said, it had a nuclear reactor involved in powering it. It had a certain domed coverage, a huge underground network with malls, amusement attractions, all of the amenities of modern-day Toronto, as it said. It involved also building rail networks and roads throughout the Arctic that would both open up the vast amounts of resources, but also extend civilization into these zones. To this very day, Canada is the biggest landmass with the smallest population. We only have 6 cities strung around a maybe 100-kilometer distance to the U.S. border. Very highly underdeveloped. There's almost nothing beyond that limited small bandwidth. And that's by imperial design to keep a wall separating the U.S. and Russia in large measure. Again, this all has to be kept in the mind as you think about how are we criticizing China and what is China doing differently for their native minority populations? How is the policy different, or how is Russia's policy different to its Inuit, who have very similar characteristics to the Canadian and Alaskan Inuits, but they don't have the same problems because they haven't suffered the same generations of social engineering as the North American natives have suffered. So here to give you just a sense of his spirit and the vision that he was planning on bringing online, Diefenbaker gave a speech in 1958 saying, "We intend to launch for the future. We have laid the foundations. Now the long-range objectives of this party, which is the Conservative Party of his time, we ask from you a mandate, a new and a stronger mandate to pursue the planning and to carry to fruition our new national development program for Canada. This national development policy will create a new sense of national purpose and national identity. One Canada, One Canada wherein Canadians will have preserved to them the control of their own economic and political destinies. Sir John A. Macdonald gave his life to this party. He opened up the West. He saw Canada from east to west. I see a new Canada, a Canada of the North. We will assist the provinces with their cooperation in the conservation of the renewable resources. We will aid in projects which are self-liquidating. We will aid in projects which, while not self-liquidating, will lead to the development of the national resources for the opening of Canada's North Land. We will open that North Land for development by improving transportation and communication and by the development of power, by the building of access roads. We will make an inventory of our hydroelectric potential. This is the message that I give to you, my fellow Canadians. Not one of defeatism, jobs. Jobs for hundreds of thousands of Canadian people. A new vision, a new hope, a new soul for Canada. And he meant it. It didn't happen, but he meant it. He even had the means to think it through. When it came to how are you going to fund this gigantic project? Okay, this is 1958. There's a massive recession going on around the world, tied to the blow up of a bubble located in the U.S. Automobile sector. It was artificial, but anyway, there was a big contraction of capital. How are you going to get that capital to do this? On top of that, there's another problem where the victory bonds that people had invested in during World War II to beat Hitler, those victory bonds were now maturing. So there were millions of dollars that the government had to somehow figure out how do you create these millions of dollars to pay back the maturing victory bonds, while at the same time overcoming the problems of a recession going on that has contracted liquidity. So how do you do that? How do you get that capital to build this multi-billion-dollar Northern Frontier project? This would have totally transformed the Native communities, by the way, and their identities would have totally been transformed if this had gone forward. But he discovered it. He discovered it because he had loved Franklin Roosevelt. He studied Roosevelt's New Deal, and he studied Lincoln. He loved both of those two guys. And he studied how Lincoln funded the Transcontinental Railway through greenbacks. And he talks about that in his autobiography. And he describes here in another speech in 1958, this is the largest financial project in our history. Offers an opportunity to all holders of victory bonds, which were purchased as an act of patriotic faith during the war years, to reinvest them for the greater development of Greater Canada. These monies that were advanced during the days of war and which contributed to the victory, we now ask to be made available to speed the pace of peaceful progress and the program of national development. The action we are taking will make it possible for our nation to embark on a new era of peacetime prosperity far and beyond anything we have ever known. So what was he proposing here to do? He said, we need to take control of the Bank of Canada, which was a national bank, and have the citizens who own the victory bonds convert their victory bonds through a conversion loan into development bonds that would then be tied to getting everybody to have a personal investment in the growth of their nation as a whole, which is exactly how the greenbacks worked. That's kind of how that is exactly how the victory bonds worked. And just because it has been done in times of war, it's never been proven why it can't work in times of peace, if not better, because you're not destroying half the capital or more that you're creating by building bombs that ultimately kill the lives of workers, potential consumers, and also the product that you're building. So in peacetime, this really would have worked. The problem was, and there's a big problem, the governor of the Bank of Canada at the time was a guy named James Coyne. James Coyne was a Rhodes Scholar. He was a highly placed Rhodes Scholar. Yeah. And he was highly enmeshed in the entire imperial program for a new world order, a one world government, and depopulation. And his policy, as the governor of the Bank of Canada, was a money contraction policy. So he wanted tight money, kind of like the way the IMF tells Greece or other countries that when they're in a financial bind, you commit more austerity and you cut the budget. You don't spend on infrastructure. So that was his view. Diefenbaker went to war with him, and he fired him. That was the first and only time a prime minister fired the governor of the governor of a Bank of Canada. It almost never happens. It's on par with JFK firing Allen Dulles. Now, JFK is also president in the United States at this time, right? So while I said Diefenbaker he loved FDR, he loved Lincoln, he also had the problem that he didn't understand JFK, and he loved the Queen. He didn't like JFK, and he loved the monarchy, and he loved this naive romantic idea of the British Empire. So on the one hand, after he fired James Coyne goes on to not accept the demand for resignation. He makes a press conference that's repeated in all of the mainstream press in Canada, saying that Diefenbaker is persecuting the poor governor of the Bank of Canada, and James Coyne is turned into a folk hero by the press, kind of like what they did for James Comey, who was fired by Trump in 2017. James Comey was turned into liberal media as a folk hero against the big bad fascist orange man tyrant. And basically, Comey leads a new movement against Diefenbaker, which leads to Diefenbaker's loss in support over 2 years. This is a war being waged, and Diefenbaker ultimately falters. The whole thing is run by a series of Rhodes Scholars in Canada and the Privy Council office, including people within Diefenbaker's own cabinet. Later on, Diefenbaker thinks back about this when he writes his autobiography, and he's thinking, shit, man, I made a lot of mistakes. And he writes saying that the civil service, which is sort of the deep state, that's how the deep state operates, whether in the US or in Canada, he says the civil service is there to advise upon, but not to determine policy. A minister is there to see that government policy is carried out within his department. That said, had I been returned to office in 1965, there would have been some major changes made. It became obvious to me as soon as we were out of office in 1963 that there were quite a number of senior people in the public service about whom I had not known, who had simply been underground, quietly working against my government and waiting for the Liberals to return to power. So,
Sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar, huh? That's why I said. I mean, when I read this again, it's like it just there's so many parallels to what's going on now with Trump. It's astounding. So another guy at the same time, you had JFK did get along really, really well with another Canadian who was the premier of British Columbia for 20 years, from 1952 to 72, called William Bennett, W.A.C. Bennett. And Bennett was a guy who largely went to war with the Ottawa, with the Privy Council office, with these Rhodes Scholars embedded within his own provincial cabinet, who were always trying to put sand into the gears of development. He was able to overcome it by nationalizing BC Hydro, by working with JFK, who gave him full U.S. backing to build water projects in the north called the Peace River water hydroelectric projects, which were part of a broader continental water program that would have involved moving a lot of excess water, unused water runoff from the north of Canada and Alaska into the continent, down into California, Texas, called the North American Water and Power Alliance, which JFK as well as Bobby Kennedy were in support of. Bennett was in support of this, and even some of those projects as part of that design happened under Bennett's lead. So this was done. And today, for example, the forest fires and everything else would not be happening in California if NWAPA was not sabotaged when it was sabotaged. So that's another thing to think about. And I gave a presentation on that people could see on my the Canadian Patriot YouTube channel. So what we have there are two images of what Bennett did for rail development. And Bennett wanted to open up the north and connect rail into Alaska and beyond. He went very far, and what you see on the left side is the image of what was done. Again, always with a fight. It was never done without a giant fight to build all the way to Dease Lake. His grand design involved what you see on the right-hand side, a connection into Alaska through the Yukon. That would have opened up completely new corridors of development like we've never seen. This was also sabotaged. How was it sabotaged? Well, in 1968, Pierre Elliott Trudeau brings in systems analysis and cybernetics with the Club of Rome into Canada. So Pierre Elliott Trudeau becomes the prime minister with this Liberal Party takeover. Diefenbaker is ousted in a coup d'etat in 1963. JFK is killed a little bit before that in 1963 under its own coup. Let's just get that straight. What happened in the U.S. was a coup. And the new policy became increasingly, don't develop the continent. Apply ecosystems management to create these artificial blockades saying that nature is pure, pristine, and must never be touched by human technology, because that's always a bad thing. Obviously, that can be a bad thing if you do it stupidly or you just want to extract a resource for money without any sense of real development. Yeah, you could do a lot of damage. However, does that make it intrinsically bad? Hell no. They wanted to create a logic saying that any time that human beings apply technology and science to change the nature, whether it's greening a desert or building liquid natural gas pipeline or a rail, it's always bad. It's always unnatural. The human mind is what they were saying was unnatural. So Pierre Trudeau, when he came to power, the first thing he did is he started creating nature protected lands that were undevelopable by law on the west coast around British Columbia, specifically targeting all of the zones where Bennett and Diefenbaker had planned to build rail and water diversion projects. As a quick addition here, one of the key guys who was in charge of destroying these projects was General MacNaughton. General MacNaughton is a genocidal war. He's called a war hero. He actually used Canadians as cannon fire in the Battle of Dieppe in World War II that just killed tens of thousands of Canadians, sending them into machine gun fire, knowing that was going to happen as part of a prolongation of the war. And the guy was ordered as the Knight of the Order of Bath for services rendered. Now, he was the key guy who was set up to chair the International Joint Commission that was, the thing created to organize interboundary water for Canada and the USA in the early 1900s. Now, as the head of this thing, his job was to destroy the NWAPA project, the North American Water and Power Lines. The key guy, his key lawyer, who worked with him to justify why boundary water transfers should never occur, was a guy named Major General Louis Mortimer Bloomfield. For those who don't know, Bloomfield was the guy who he worked originally for the OSS. He was a Montreal-based pervert who was part of MI6, and he set up what was called Permindex, the Permanent Industrial Exposition. This is the organization that was caught red-handed trying to orchestrate the assassinations of Charles de Gaulle, Enrico Mattei, several other statesmen, and also John F. Kennedy. This is the thing that ran John F. Kennedy's assassination from Montreal, Canada. This is the same guy who was the key lawyer on why, blocking NWAPA. So just to say, this is all connected. So the Human Flagpole policy is now modified to both tell the native communities that you are intrinsically, to basically try to brainwash them to be convinced that they are intrinsically anti-technology, so that they could be used as a buffer for development, while at the same time extending all protected land rights to zones that the empire really didn't care about the land. They didn't care about protecting land, whether in North America or whether in Africa, where you look at all of these like World Wildlife Fund protected reserves in Africa, the majority of them house terrorists like Boko Haram and other terrorist groups. And they're usually located on borders in Africa, which facilitates controlled genocides and chaos operations, which has been the policy going back to the days of Rhodes and Milner. So all that to say, the empire who's orchestrating these things doesn't care about nature. Increasingly, with this policy, with Pierre Trudeau doing this, you have, it's 1968, 69, 70, 71. You have the destruction of the fixed exchange rate gold reserve system, the unleashing of a post-industrial model, a consumer society model. And all of a sudden, you can see from this graph here, from 1970 onward, you have an acceleration of decay. What we used to have is 40% of the workforce working in industry, manufacturing, all of a sudden starts sliding faster and faster, while the service sector increases exponentially, to the point that today we're at a situation where less than 20% work in anything productive. I think far less than 20%, because even the very definition of productivity has been like really weakened. And most people working in the economy right now don't have a clue what real value is, which is why you get things like derivatives. Deregulation happened that allowed for derivatives and these bubbles to be created in the next 40-year period, which are now today a ticking time bomb waiting to blow. So if you look at it, what are the consequences to this policy for natives, especially for Inuits? You have suicide rates among Canadian natives is 3 times higher than the national average today, with 5 times more Indigenous women committing suicide than women of other non-native groups, and 11 times more suicides in Inuit populations than in other groups in Canada. 11 times more. Natives living on reserves are 2.4 times more likely to commit suicide than those natives living off reserves. Native communities only represent 2.6% of the total population and yet account for over 11% of all opioid deaths. Huge disparity. Infant mortality among natives is 3 times higher than the national average. Native life expectancy is over 10 years shorter. and 47% of Native children live in poverty, with that number increasing across every province and territory. Just quick stats, right? There's more in terms of abuse and other things, but I just got that across to get across just how sick the policy is. Now, there are some residual projects that could begin to change this in positive ways. I named 4 of the biggest ones currently on the table that are shovel ready. In some cases, have made some progress. You have the Alaska-Canada Railway that Donald Trump endorsed to build a rail project finally from Alberta through Yukon to Alaska. That would create 18,000 jobs. It would be a $12 billion project. No, $18 billion project, US. You have the Keystone XL pipeline, which was just canceled by President Biden. That would have created 18,000 jobs immediately, many of them native populations, high-paying, high-quality jobs, moving oil down to Nebraska. Yeah. Then you have, actually, it was liquid gas. Then you have the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is on the upper right-hand side, moving Albertan oil into ports in Vancouver, which would be sending a lot of this oil and natural gas to the Asian markets as a primary purchaser. That might be canceled. We don't even know at any moment, frankly. And then another one, which is highly being sabotaged right now, is the Coastal LNG Link, which is a it involves also employment for like 12,000 people. A lot of them are natives. And then there's tertiary and secondary and tertiary employments as well. It's not just the immediate jobs building this thing that you have to think about. It's all of the other secondary and tertiary jobs servicing the. It's dynamic. So we're told that natives are against this. I mean, a lot of people in Montreal and Toronto and a lot of in New York and in a lot of the fluffy, comfortable zones of North America are told that this is these are big oil projects out to destroy and impose eco-colonialism onto natives. Now, when you actually look at these projects, especially the Coastal LNG Link program, which goes through primarily 20 different native band zones, you actually have a lot of support. People living in these reserves don't have the same delusions as comfortable people living in the city centers who are just so detached from reality on the ground. So I got 3 quotes that I just love. One of them is the chief counselor to the Haisla Nation tribe, which is one of the tribes that would be benefiting immensely from the coastal LNG, who said First Nations have been left out of resource development for too long. But in this project, we are involved. We have been consulted, and we will ensure that there are benefits for all First Nations. I am tired of managing poverty. I'm tired of First Nations communities dealing with issues such as suicide, low unemployment, or educational opportunities. If this opportunity is lost, it doesn't come back. 2 other quotes that I like. One is First Nations Councillor Karen Ogun-Toes, co-creator of the First Nations LNG Alliance. If our people are living in poverty, then the way to overcome it is through proper training, trades, education, and jobs. My conscience is clear. And then this other great one from a Wet'suwet'en youth leader. The Wet'suwet'en tribes were the tribes that were used to justify these mass protests last year all across Canada, shutting down rail, transit, blocking highways, really bad. Most of it was, I'd say 95% were mostly white sociology students from the cities, from the universities, being deployed by radical anarchist ideologue teachers who are of no connection whatsoever to the actual tribes. And a few natives were used as front people to sort of make it to put on a native face, but it really was not indigenous to the natives as a movement. But this young guy, Troy, says if the environmentalists are successful, it will be one of the biggest cultural appropriations in British Columbia's history. So yeah, I mean, this is the thing. One of the key guys, this is the last quote. I could have picked a lot more quotes, but I just love this one. He's a member of the Legislative Assembly, a native himself, Ellis Ross, who said, many of those lining up against the Coastal GasLink pipeline are non-Aboriginal, while some are even from south of the border. Foreign influence is nothing new, but what we are seeing today is a well-executed campaign financed by the likes of Soros's Tides Foundation and the US-based Rockefeller Foundation. And he just calls it out. This guy's pretty strong. Take a look back now, review what China has actually done. with its Uyghur population. And keep in mind, the Uyghurs represent just one of 8 different Muslim minority groups. So the fact that Canada and the Netherlands and the US and the National Endowment for Democracy have bleeding hearts over the Uyghurs, and not all of these other ethnic Muslim groups, has everything to do with geopolitics. It's not really about caring about them. Now, it has everything to do with this map regarding the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you look at the northwest of China, where you have Xinjiang, the biggest province, this is where you have the Southern Silk Road connection going in through, Afghanistan, Pakistan. The Pakistan Economic Corridor is right below that in South Xinjiang. You have Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and then through these zones, we see directly that this rail corridor goes through Iran, through Turkey, but those branch off points into Iraq, into Syria, into Lebanon, down even deeper into Africa, through Egypt. These are all. This is 11,000 kilometers of distance of motion of goods, of services, of other things, passenger rail too, that connects east to west and creates a different type of model of economic development, which the empire controlling the West doesn't want anybody to know about or to do. The cultural policy, which also involves, this isn't on this map, but Russia is playing a key role in this. And the Polar Silk Road that I mentioned, this is an image of the maritime component, but the land-based component of rail and roads are also extending up. Currently, if you look at what is being intended through by building the northern route for transit of freight goods, this cuts off 10 days of travel time from goods from China to Europe. It allows you to bypass the over-congested Straits of Malacca and the Straits of Suez. Russia currently, and this is an offer by Russia to build the Bering Strait rail connection that they revived in 2011. They offered to pay $60 billion towards building this project. So this is already ongoing for a while. China co-endorsed this as well. It's there as an olive branch if we chose to accept it. Quick facts about the Polar Silk Road, okay? So we have the upgrading of global transportation corridors involving the Northern Sea Route. That's what you saw as an image. You have the Northern Latitudinal Railway connecting Western Siberian ports on the Arctic Ocean with rail. You have a boost of freight traffic by 4-fold by 2025. From 20 million tons today, it would be up to 80 million tons. That's huge, massive increase. The creation of new nuclear-powered icebreakers. Canada has 0. The U.S. has 2 derelict ones. Russia and China are streaming ahead. You have vast programs for resource development. The China Arctic Research Center as a scientific collaborative center. This ties into the Russia-China space programs to co-develop a lunar base as well. You have the Chinese port of Dalian to Rotterdam. I already mentioned that, cut by 10 days. And the Yamal LNG pipeline, the Power of Siberia 3,000-mile pipeline to China. It's almost done. There's going to be a second building of this thing. An expansion of this. When this is all done, Russia already is the number 1 supplier of energy. It's going to be far beyond anything the rest of the world is doing. China was originally being courted by Canada to become addicted to the honeypot of cheap resources in Canada throughout the days of Stephen Harper, 2009, 10, 11, 12. And when they realized what Canada was and as a geopolitical British chess piece in this big thing, they decided not to get addicted to Canadian oil that could be turned off as soon as they were addicted and enmeshed at the will of the oligarchy. And they chose instead to start investing with the bond of survival of Russia, intelligently so, because until Canada can begin to act like a sovereign nation the way it was under John Diefenbaker, it's not trustworthy currently, sadly. And the last slide here, the last image I have on Xinjiang, just to compare with what we just went through with the Canadian natives and the destruction of the Canadian natives over the past 75 years. Xinjiang, GDP, just to read this quickly, okay? Increased by 100-fold between 1978 and 2020. 20% school enrollment of children in Xinjiang in 1949 has risen to 99.9% today.
Terrible.
God forbid.
God.
Such brainwashing. 1949, you had 30 years average life expectancy in Xinjiang. Today, it's up to 72 years. You got projects.
Those evil Chinese.
Yeah, contributing to overpopulation.
Commie bastards.
Yeah. And so they're talking about genocide of Xinjiang of Uyghurs. The Uyghur population has increased immensely in 30 years. They've prospered and increased quality and quantity. China's one-child policy that they had for its whole population from 1979 to 2014, it never applied that to the Uyghurs, the Muslim population. They never had those limits. They could have as many kids as they wanted.
People don't realize the one China policy only affects the native Han Chinese. That's it.
Exactly. If you're Buddhist, if you're Christian, and there are Christians, and I'm going to say something about that. You never had to abide by that. So there's de-desertification projects. They're extending economic development, training, trade schools. They've increased it from 15% forest coverage, where there's a lot of desert, to 23.5% in only 20 years. This has increased evapotranspiration because all of a sudden plants breathe, forests breathe. There's increased cloud coverage and overall general cooling. So if you really care about global warming, you green deserts. You don't go for green energy grids or solar panels. That only increases deserts. That makes things warmer. You have the Terra Basin Water Project that's revived these lost basins that are needed for the next generations of agriculture. You have roads and rail that have, for the first time, connected all of the villages in Xinjiang. Xinjiang is huge. It represents the size of something like 12 European countries. It's huge.
Correct. It's a monster. It's huge. It's like taking Alaska and Texas and slamming it together almost.
Yeah, it's ridiculously big to think about. You have the Lanzhou Rumqi high-speed rail, which is now being finalized. It's going to be running parallel to the electrified Langshan passenger rail. And when this is completely done, the Langshan passenger rail is going to be turned into a freight rail, and that'll be part of the whole Eurasian continental land bridge. You have the Ruoqian Hotan Railway, which is going to play a loop around the Taklamakan Desert. There's the 600-kilometer Kashgar-Osh Railway from China to Kyrgyzstan to Uzbekistan. This is a zone of radical Wahhabism that has grew since the 1990s, funded by the Saudis, where these groups, many of them Uyghur, were then deployed into Iraq, into Syria to conduct jihad against the governments there, and also back into creating an Eastern Turkmenistan of China, which they call Xinjiang, East Turkmenistan, which has been at the heart of the hundreds of terrorist operations for 25 plus years in China that China's had to deal with by not bombing another country or droning people, but rather by creating trade schools. And if you're a Muslim and you want to study in a mosque, it's very easy in Xinjiang. There's 24,000 mosques in Xinjiang. It's the highest density of mosques, I think, anywhere in the world per capita for the Muslim population. There's another 280 churches for Orthodox Christian Protestants and Catholics.
What? I thought the church was being slaughtered like lambs in China.
Yeah,
I thought they were being thrown in concentration camps with the Uyghurs.
I know. No, it's crazy how much. And if you look at the reason why these bullshit stats are being supported.
But I read it in Epoch Times.
Exactly. So who's funding Epoch Times? Falun Gong. Who's Falun Gong?
CIA.
Exactly. And what is the World Uyghur Congress, which is running a lot of these statistics too? This is also funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which Max Blumenthal did a great.
Exactly.
Blumenthal did a great expose on this. So, I mean, all of this stuff, it's all psyops. It's not real. And China and Russia...
I'm just waiting for them to set up a School of Americas right outside of the border of Myanmar, man. That's gonna be
man, they want to. They're drooling over it. So it's
spread more freedom.
Yeah. So that's it. That's the way you do a real cultural policy. If you really care about your minority groups, you do it that way, the way China and Russia are doing it. You don't do it the way these racists running the British Empire are doing it. And you're going to get better results.